Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Boricua BC2 show. I am your host, Bill Cancel. I am truly honored today to be sitting here with a guest who is a renowned professor. I'm just really speechless to even to have the opportunity to meet this man. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Sanford Levinson to the show. Mr. Levinson, how are you, sir?
Fine. Delighted to be here.
Thank you, thank you. Sandy, when I prepare for these shows, I try to think of an interesting first question to kind of start things off and get the ball rolling, right? So the one that I came up with is with your background, with your massive amounts of history that you have, and so on and so forth. What is really eating at you right now today? What's scaring you the most right now?
It's an excellent question. One answer is Donald Trump.
Yeah,
Another answer, though, which in many ways is more important, is what I believe is the systematic unwillingness of the American people, and I would blame primarily so-called American political leaders to address the possibility that the Constitution itself is a major part of the problem.
yeah,
What we
yeah,
do is to demonize people we don't like.
right,
And I could take the rest of our time together to demonize Donald Trump, whom I despise.
yeah,
But it is important to realize that Donald Trump doesn't come out of nowhere.
right,
We have a political system that has allowed him to triumph. And the game of gotcha that some Republicans play is legitimate with regard to saying, well, what about, and then fill in the blank, going back to Harry Truman and his unilateral decision to enter the Korean War
right.
without congressional approval. I could march through each and every one of the presidencies, both Democratic and Republican, and talk not only about overreach, but why it is that there has been a great deal of support for what might be called presidential overreach because of a thoroughly correct perception that Congress is broken,
Yeah.
that wherever you are on the political spectrum, right, left, center, far left, far right, it really doesn't matter. It is wildly unlikely that you feel confident that Congress will address whatever you happen to think the most significant problems of the day are.
So
And
Sandy, just to stay on that because it kind of ties into your earlier comment, which is actually my second question. Um, Congress dysfunctional. I think to a degree, Constitution dysfunctional. How do we change all that now?
well, it's
That's a $64,000
no,
question. I get
I
it,
mean,
but yeah.
it's actually very funny because literally in front of me on the computer right now is an essay I'm writing
Right,
for the National Constitution Center, which is sponsoring a discussion of what a new constitutional convention, which I support,
right.
might look like. And one of the realities, which I freely confess, is that extraordinarily few people support a new constitutional convention.
Could you stop there, sir? I don't mean to cut you off, but could you stop there just so the entire audience understands what do you mean when you say a constitutional convention? Let everybody understand what it is.
But what I mean is recourse to Article 5 of the Constitution itself, the amendment
Right.
article, which says there are two ways to get constitutional amendments. One of them is that Congress proposes and states ratify. That's the way we have, in fact, always done it. But in fact, Article 5 says if two-thirds of the states petition Congress to call a national convention, then Congress must do that. And that's never happened.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I emphasize in my teaching. And I'll mention that my wife and I have written a book together, the third edition of which is coming out literally in 2 weeks,
Hmm.
called Fault Lines in the Constitution. One of the things that I emphasize whenever I can is that if you look at the American states, they have had over 235 conventions in our history. There is nothing un-American about conventions, about updating the Constitution. New Jersey's Constitution, for example, goes back to 1948, Illinois, 1972, Montana, 1972. Um, it is only the national Constitution that is treated as the equivalent of a sacred text. So we have very few amendments to the Constitution. And the idea of full scale reflection and choice about whether it serves us well is off the table. I use those words because they are literally in the very first paragraph of The Federalist. What Alexander Hamilton wrote under the name Publius is that what Americans were demonstrating to the entire world is that we as a collective people were capable of reflection and choice about how to be governed. That was the radical aspect of the American Revolution.
Right.
We exercise reflection and choice with regard to state constitutions. We don't with regard to the national constitution. And so the answer to your question is that nobody really knows what a new national convention would look like. It is also the case that most people, including, I will say, my wife, with whom I co-authored this book, most of my friends, family, and professional colleagues are opposed to a new Constitutional Convention, which is viewed as a Pandora's box and better the devil we know than the devil we might get. I persist in believing that the current Constitution is sufficiently devilish that we ought to think of a new Constitutional Convention.
What specifically in what areas do you think is particularly devilish, Sandy?
Okay, the title of our book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, borrows from geology,
Okay.
tectonic plates
Sure.
that we ignore most of the time. I went to law school at Stanford. Stanford happens to be built quite literally on top of the San Andreas Fault.
Hmm.
Everybody knows about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and about the fact that sometime there's going to be another big one. But I assure you, I enjoyed Stanford a great deal. And I enjoyed it because one simply denied the possibility of another big one. And so we go through 22 different sorts of equivalents of the San Andreas Fault. Some of them are very well known. The Electoral College, the assignment of equal voting power in the Senate to Wyoming and California, to Vermont and Texas. Others are quite esoteric. The fact that if there were a successful terrorist attack or simply pandemic that killed most members of the House of Representatives, we could not replace them except after a number of months because the Constitution requires that every member of the House be elected. Unlike the Senate, dead senators are not a problem, quite
Hmm.
frankly. Dead senators can be replaced the next day in most states by governors.
Right.
There are other problems we talk about in between everybody knows about the Electoral College and nobody thinks about the continuity in government problem. Um, the presidentialism itself, I have come to believe, has its devilish qualities
Sure.
because there has been such a temptation, especially since World War II, whatever political party you're in, to say we can't rely on Congress, so let's just give the president more and more power. Back in the 30s, Benjamin Cardozo, a liberal member of the Supreme Court, referred to, quote, delegation run riot. In the ensuing 90 years, the riot has certainly continued. And any halfway competent, sympathetic presidentialist can find legislation that basically allows the president to do whatever
To
he
do
wants.
anything exactly.
That Barack Obama originally said when people wanted him to engage in significant immigration reform by executive order, look, I'm not an emperor, I'm not a king. Congress has to do it. The Senate, in fact, did it. But then John Boehner, the Republican Speaker of the House, refused to bring it to a vote because it didn't have the support of a majority of Republicans. It would have easily passed the House
Right.
with a coalition of Democrats and some moderate Republicans, but Boehner just kept it off. Then Obama said, you know what? I do have the power. And so we got DACA. And
Right.
as a political liberal, I'm happy with DACA. But it really does raise problems about how power is allocated. And so, I mean, I think the tariffs are outrageous,
Yeah, I am
but
with
the,
you.
but the tariffs are based on delegation to the president. He's
Right.
not doing anything. Well, there are some lawyers who think that there are some statutory problems. But by and large, he can rely on statutes for what is basically a dictatorial power over the American economy. And so, if we had the convention I want, one of the things we would talk about is whether presidentialism itself is such a great idea in the 21st century. And I think I have come to believe that the answer is no.
Right.
Nobody's really talking about this. We simply assume that powerful presidents are hardwired into the system and nothing can be done about it.
Sandy, I think the underlying message that I keep hearing you say is that we as a nation need to stop taking things for granted as they were, and it's really now time to rethink the entire thing. Is that where your head is at?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good summary, but most people don't want to do it.
Right. Understood. I,
And
I get it.
and more to the point, if you're if you think practically, then you can make a thoroughly plausible argument that it's simply quixotic.
Right.
Think that this kind of change is possible because Article 5 itself makes constitutional change so inordinately difficult. It's a kind of abandon all hope, ye who enter there.
Right.
Um,
It, if you had, and what concerns me about what you're saying is two things. Number one, I believe everything you said. I agree with everything you said. One of my biggest fears that I have is that our government, as defined, continues to move at glacial speed.
yeah,
Uh, there's nothing slower at this point, right?
yeah, it's a
So,
dinosaur.
yeah. So, but if something happened, whether through convention or through amendment change, whatever, where we had to change, I don't know, five or six amendments to the Constitution, what would you say? Okay, at a minimum, we have to do these five or six right now.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I will betray the fact that I'm an academic
Right.
because I really don't have a copy of the Levinson Constitution in my coat pocket to say, well, here are the 22 things I think everybody should do. Because what so frustrates me is that there's so little conversation about any of them.
Right.
Even the Electoral College, which has been criticized by a majority of the American people in
Yes.
every poll taken since
Yes.
1994,
Absolutely. No argument there for
remains
sure.
alive and well. So, you know, the problem is that Donald Trump, I want to say for better or worse, I really want to say for worse, but he is demonstrating that someone who's willing to be the bull in the china shop can act. And he is cutting the Gordian knot. He is daring Congress to stop him. And the Republican Party has basically become a cult party
Yep.
that has adopted what I have called the Führerprinzip from Germany in 1933, where, with extraordinarily few exceptions, and the exceptions are announcing that they're not running for re-election,
Hmm.
they have sworn personal loyalty to Donald Trump rather than genuinely to be faithful to the Constitution
Right.
or even to be particularly faithful to the interests of their constituents.
Right.
Um,
Unbelievable.
so the problem I have, and I should emphasize that I am both a political scientist and a lawyer.
Right.
And so, and increasingly, I think much more like a political scientist than like a lawyer. So the problem is that even if one designs a better political system, as I think we could and should do, you also must have a requisite political culture
Yes.
that will enable the system to operate effectively.
Yeah.
So that, for example, James Madison in Federalist 51 says, well, what's going to make the system work is that the ambition of the person will be attached to the ambitions for the place, so
Right.
that members of Congress will be jealous to prevent executive overreaching, because after all, they're members of Congress and they will be loyal to Congress as a decision-making body, and they will check and balance presidents. It hasn't worked out that way.
No.
We have uh, two friends of mine at NYU, Rick Pildes and Darrell Levinson, who's no relation, wrote a wonderful essay 20 years ago called Separation of Parties, not separation um, of branches, not separation of
Right.
powers.
Right.
And what they point out is that party loyalty now takes precedence over institutional loyalty, that members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, are absolutely useless
Yes.
with regard to checking and balancing Donald Trump. But quite frankly, most Democratic members of Congress were no more interested in really scrutinizing Joe Biden. That, I mean, I continue every day to be more and more angry about the dereliction of duty by so-called Democratic leaders with regard to looking the other way,
Hmm.
with regard to
Yes.
Biden's insistence on running for reelection. So that can't really be attributed to, well, if only the Constitution were designed better. It also relates to the fact that members of Congress really don't care about preserving the prerogatives of Congress, um, and are more than happy to accept presidential, quote, leadership, unquote. And the presidency becomes ever more powerful, not only because of delegation run riot, but because of the ability of singular presidents so to control the public debate um, that opposition parties in the United States, who knows who their leaders are? There's no leader of the Democratic
No,
Party.
not at all, sir.
Um, One might have thought in 2022 that we didn't know who the leader of the Republican Party was because a lot of people would have thought after January 6th, in addition to Donald Trump himself being in his late 70s and also being incompetent, that surely the Republicans would look elsewhere. But for whatever reason, he was able to clear the table. But it really is a general problem that, one of the reasons Trump emerged was that once Mitt Romney was beaten in 2012, the Republicans had no leader.
That's right.
So that the 2016 primary was a bizarre beauty contest of 17 people, all of whom with such strong egos that none of them would say, I'm not going to make it.
Right.
So I'm going to coalesce around fill in the blank, but surely not Donald Trump,
Hmm.
because almost all of them agreed that Donald Trump was a clown. But their egos prevailed. Trump got the nomination without a majority of Republican voters in the primaries.
Right.
And then he managed to become president because of the crazy electoral college.
Exactly. Stacey, Sandy, this is kind of an embarrassing question, but I really want to hear your opinion on this. Do you think part of the problem that we have in this country is the fact that so many Americans don't understand the Constitution?
Sure. Um, One of the things that a lot of people agree upon is that the status of so-called civic education is dismal.
Yes.
That as we move more and more to STEM as the end all and be all, the preparation of kids for jobs, and who knows what that means in an age of artificial intelligence. But that is what more and more universities are concerned about. That is what more school systems are concerned about. And so budgets in what used to be called civic education, civics, social studies have been cut. And that means that most American students, and therefore most of the American people, are not well educated, especially about the structural features of our government. Such civic education as occurs, which is generally weak, often is focused on hot button issues before the Supreme Court.
Right.
A number of Supreme Court judges lament the weakness of civic education, but what they mean by civic education is more emphasis placed on the kind of issues that come before the Supreme Court. Now, they're all interesting, they're all worth talking about at length, but the Supreme Court does not address the legitimacy of Wyoming and California,
Hmm.
each having two votes
Right.
in the Senate. That's just written into the Constitution.
Right. Right.
The
It goes back to
Supreme
your earlier
Court
point. Yeah.
doesn't address the fact that the President of the United States has an unusually strong veto power, and that presidents almost always win veto contests with Congress because, especially in the modern world, it is stunningly unlikely to get two-thirds votes to override a
Yes.
presidential veto.
Yes.
Those are viewed as dull and boring issues. The impetus behind the book that my wife and I wrote together is to try to persuade readers and teachers. And I will say that the book is used in a number of high schools and junior colleges
Mm.
to persuade them that the structural issues are not dull and boring, but in fact help to explain why most Americans are just extraordinarily frustrated these days. They tell pollsters that the country is going in the wrong direction. They do not have much confidence in Congress. They are alienated from the national government. And this is far, far more because of the structural features of the Constitution
Right.
going back to 1787 than the issues before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Speaking of the U.S. Supreme Court, I'd love to ask you this question. What is your opinion on the presidential immunity? Was that a mistake?
Yes, yes. It was a mistake in a number of ways. First of all, as Justice Barrett noted in her own opinion, there was no earthly need to write such a broad opinion as the Supreme Court did.
Right.
If they wanted to bail Donald Trump out on the specifics, they could have done that without writing this
Right. I
extraordinarily broad
totally agree.
decision.
Totally agree.
Secondly, the implication of their decision is that basically the president is king and never has to worry about accountability. Impeachment is a joke. Impeachment simply does not work. So that one of the things I would want in a new constitutional convention is a system of no confidence votes,
Right.
where
Exactly.
you would address the basic question, do you have trust in this decision maker, rather than have a lawyerly discussion, which
Hmm.
I think does not serve the country well. Did the president commit a high crime and misdemeanor? I don't really care. I care much more about the judgment of a president regarding issues of war and peace, life and death, basic issues of the economy, than whether or not the president cheated at cards.
Right. Exactly.
And but um, that's not the system we've got,
Right.
unfortunately.
Right.
The Supreme Court simply reinforced the notion that the president is basically a king. That is terrible.
To add to that point, I was shocked to learn this myself, but there's a lot of talk, like on social media, about at some point in time, maybe the Supreme Court will rescind that ruling, right? But I understand to do that, somebody needs to bring a case first, that it has to go through the whole appellate thing and so on and so forth to get to SCOTUS. Do you
Oh,
see that
and
ever happening?
sure, I mean, Supreme Court reverses its opinions some frequently, particularly this Supreme Court,
Right,
which pays little attention to precedent, but it will take new appointments.
right.
And one of the other people I find myself being unforgiving toward is Ruth Ginsburg.
Really?
That, yes, she had no business remaining on the Supreme
Oh,
Court
I understood. Understood.
after
Yeah,
2013.
understood.
We're in the pickle we are, in part because of the egomania of Ruth Ginsburg and Joe Biden.
Right.
Now, it's not that the Constitution required it, but the Constitution is interpreted as giving full life tenure to members of the Supreme Court. So we rely on their good judgment to know when it's
When it's
time
time
to
to go.
go.
Right.
And she displayed appalling, egocentric misjudgment. And then Joe Biden displayed the same sort of egomania in insisting on running for reelection, which was not unconstitutional, but it simply reflected his own lack of self-discipline.
Right.
And
Understood. Understood. We have three questions left, my friend. The next one, and this is a scary question. I'm afraid of your answer. How close are we to losing our democracy?
well, a quick answer for perhaps another program
Okay, sure.
is, have we ever had a genuine democracy? That
It's a great answer.
one might argue that the answer was no prior to 1965
Right.
and the Voting Rights Act of 65, which of course the current majority is intent on gutting. Or you might be more of an optimist and say, oh, yeah, we were always kind of a democracy if you ignore the fact that women couldn't vote, etc. And we're in danger of losing that, but not because elections won't take place. I don't really fear that. The problem, of course, is the role that money plays in
Yes.
elections
Yes, of course.
and other factors, so that gerrymandering, etc.,
Yep.
so that people say elections have consequences, which in some way is certainly true, but it's also the fact that the American election system is rigged, and it's always been rigged in ways to serve those in power. And so that's why it will require really a much, much longer answer. But yes, we're in great danger of becoming an authoritarian political system,
Right.
but one that has elections.
Yep.
Hungary has elections.
Right.
Um, you can't define the difference between an acceptable and an unacceptable political system simply by asking, do elections take place?
Right. Understood. I have to throw my one dig into this question because being Puerto Rican, I have to ask this question. You spoke about Wyoming and you spoke about California and the lack of Senate representation. What's your thoughts about Puerto Rico not having any congressional representation? Isn't that
Wonderful.
indefensible?
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. I will say that we take it up in our book. We talk about the
Really?
problem of territories,
Yeah.
not only Puerto Rico, but also District of Columbia.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But District of Columbia does get to vote for president,
Right.
but of course, it does not have a voting representative
Right.
in the House or the Senate. It's like Puerto Rico,
Right. Exactly.
a non-voting.
Right.
We think that's a fault line.
Right.
We think that both are indefensible. Um, and I teach some cases from when I used to teach introductory course. I taught the 1901 insular cases, which were all about Puerto Rico and established Puerto Rico status as a non-incorporated territory, and pointed out the Supreme Court simply made it up, and there is no justification for the way Puerto Rico is treated, just as there's no justification for treating the District of Columbia
Exactly.
it's treated. So
Exactly.
that's we talk about in our book.
Nice. So my last question to you, and this is a fun question that I ask all my guests when they come on the show. Predictions, sir. What's your predictions in the next 6 months to a year?
Things will get worse.
Yeah.
That a lot of people, including myself, are placing great hopes in the 2026 elections. That requires a belief, first of all, that the 2026 elections will take place and they'll be completely fair and little d democratic. But it also requires, frankly, that enough people who voted for Donald Trump will suffer,
Yeah.
that they
Yes.
will
Agreed.
have buyer's remorse about the entire Republican Party, which has, in fact, turned into a cult party
Right.
behind Donald Trump.
Right.
Who knows? I think that the tariffs are likely to generate a lot of second thought. There's an article about that today in the New York Times with regard to the Central Valley of California. I think that the war on immigrants is, in fact, making inroads into the shift of some Latinos in Texas, say,
Yeah.
toward the Republican Party, because everybody says, well, I wanted them to go after the criminals,
Right. Exactly.
not
Exactly.
the friendly folks next
Right.
door.
Right.
And it turns out that Stephen Miller, one of the truly awful, awful people in American history, doesn't really distinguish between criminals and the good, honest people
No. No.
next door. So, you know, the next 6 months, who really knows that what we are most attentive, what a lot of people, for better and worse, are most thinking about is the next 12, 13, 14, 15 months. That is the November elections.
Yeah.
And will that lead to the Democratic takeover of the House and maybe even the Democratic takeover of the Senate? But of course, you're in New York, aren't you?
Yes, I am, sir.
Okay, so the most interesting election
Right.
of 2025 is your own election for mayor,
Yes, mayor. Right.
and whether Mamdani will make it. And, I'm cheering him on.
Mm-hmm.
But I read every single day stories about how fat cats
Yep.
are doing
Trying to shut him
whatever they
down.
can
Yep. Yep.
to prevent the menace
Yes.
of this danger to the American way
Of
of
course.
life.
Menace.
So, I mean, that election will have consequences.
Yeah.
That either New York will have some sort of Democratic Socialist mayor, or the power of billionaires and the ability of to frighten people
Right.
by raising the specter of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, whether it applies or not, will prevail.
Yeah.
So you are on the front lines. What do you
Yeah.
predict?
I predict it's going to get worse before it gets much better. I predict very much what you're saying. A lot of things like the tariffs, the immigration things are going to start to eat away as Trump. I have a very funny belief, and I don't know where it's coming from, but I have a very funny belief that what'll take him down finally will be something stupid. Because he's so caught up with the I'm above the law, I can do whatever I want, that he's not thinking clearly, which is evident, right? And at some point in time, he's going to take that too far with something so stupid and egregious that it'll take him down.
Yep. From your mouth to God's ear.
I know. I lied. I lied. I do have one more question based on what you just said. What happens hypothetical? Let's just play hypothetical right now. What happens if we wake up tomorrow morning and Trump's dead?
We get J.D. Vance.
Where do we
And
go from there? Too early to tell.
J.D. Vance, by all accounts, is far smarter and far
Yes.
more of a raving ideologue
Yes.
than Donald Trump. Donald Trump cares exclusively about lining his own pockets.
Of course. Of
He's a
course.
grifter. That
Yeah.
is all he is. Vance presents himself as a true raving ideologue.
Right.
And I think it is fair to say in this context, he is also a relatively recent convert to
Yes.
a very conservative form of Catholicism.
Yes.
He was not a fan of Pope
Right.
Francis.
Right. Right.
And he is, in his own way, a serious person in a way that Donald Trump isn't. Now, for political junkies, and I define myself in many ways
Mm-hmm.
as a political
Mm-hmm.
junkie, the question is, would J.D. Vance automatically get the nomination in 2028?
Right.
And I think J.D. Vance is somewhat like Ted Cruz. Nobody likes Ted Cruz.
No.
Uh, and
I don't.
there's a joke in Texas. Why do people take an instant dislike to Ted Cruz? Because it saves time. And I think,
I'm using that tomorrow on my show.
and I think there is something of that with J.D. Vance.
Right.
So, I think both parties are in a process, call it transformation, collapse, whatever. There is a huge generational war going on within the Democratic Party um, over a number of issues. The, it is really unacceptable that Chuck Schumer continues to be the public face
I
of the
can't.
Democratic Party.
I can't anymore.
But, you know, I often quote, and I quote it in this thing I'm writing right now in a Constitutional Convention. I often quote what I call Roche's dictum, which I assign to John P. Roche, a political scientist from the 1960s. I've never found a print source, but I would swear under oath that I heard him say at a political science gathering in the 60s, power corrupts, and the prospect of losing power corrupts absolutely.
Oh my God, yes.
And I think that is
Yes.
what joins Ginsburg, Biden, Schumer, Trump, Mitch McConnell, and others. Lisa Murkowski,
Yeah, exactly.
that, I find her a truly interesting person because she gave some promise of having a spine, and then she just tossed it away.
All gone.
Um, so, I often say and believe that if you were a political scientist from Mars, then you would say there has never been a more exciting and interesting time
Yes, yes, exactly right.
around.
Exactly right. Uh, Professor, thank you so much. This has been I am truly awestruck by this interview. This has been fantastic. You are superb, my friend. Please, before you go, why don't you tell everybody about the books that you're working on, what's on sale, where can they buy them, and so on and so forth.
Well, as I say, it's called Fault Lines of the Constitution,
Yeah,
third edition. It is already available for pre-purchase on Amazon.
right.
It is notionally a book for kids,
Really?
and
Okay.
it looks it. It's
Yeah,
double
yeah, yeah.
column, and that's why it's assigned to some high schools and junior colleges.
Right.
I assign it to a class that I teach at the Harvard Law School.
Okay.
I do that. I always say unashamedly.
Right.
Here is the book.
Right. Nice. Very good. Thank
So,
you.
and here is what it looks like,
Yeah.
which book, for kids. But I describe it as a book for grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters. And in fact, we've been told by enough grandparents, parents, etc., that they have learned a lot from the book precisely because what is different about the book is that it focuses on structures.
Yes,
It
exactly.
does talk along the way about a few rights, and we
Right.
like rights,
Yeah, we do like
but
rights, but
it doesn't focus on it. And Cynthia, whom I always describe accurately as a prize-winning children's author, has a real facility for telling stories, so that every chapter begins with a story that is designed to pull the reader in as to why they ought to think about it.
yeah.
And so, on the 25th, it will be certainly available through Amazon. I frankly have no idea. On 22nd, Cynthia reminds me, 3 days earlier.
Hi,
I
Cynthia.
I have no idea how many general bookstores will,
Pick it
have,
up. Yeah.
because a lot of bookstores really don't do much with children's books.
Right.
But it got a very, very nice mention, offhanded mention, but a very nice mention in a book review in last Sunday's New York Times book
Very
review,
nice. Good. Congratulations. That's good.
and a starred review in a general trade publication called Booklist.
Nice.
So, and we're available to talk to anybody anywhere about it.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
I'm very grateful for your invitation.
Thank you.
I've written quite a few things, and I consider this book by far to be the most important thing that I've been associated with.
Based on this conversation that we have, I could definitely see why that book is very, very important
Yeah.
relative.
I mean, like, actually, are we on audio, or is this
This is
video?
video. This is video.
Okay, so let me
There
show
you
it.
go. Fault lines in the Constitution, everybody. Come and get it.
Yep, yep.
Professor Levinson, thank you so very much for your time. I hope to see you back here again. This was a great show. I'd like to see you again as
I,
another guest one time.
I would be delighted, and we can talk much more about what it means to call the United States a democracy.
That's our next show, my friend. Thank you very much to all the fans out there. Thank you very much. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.